My name is David ROTHENBERG, as you know, and I'm a musician and professor of philosophy and music and writer and all these things. And I started as a little kid being interested in music and nature, I would say, because my parents, when I was 6 years old, moved from New York City to suburbia, the countryside, and I would kind of wander around in the woods and listen to things, and always thought it was kind of interesting. And then, since everyone's here studying different things, I'll say a little bit about how I realized you could study this kind of thing. And when I was a teenager, I learned that near where I lived, there was this jazz musician who played with wolves and whales named Paul Winter. He's still doing it. He's in his 80s. And so he lived pretty close to me. And then, so I got to meet him. And actually, I met him because I was studying clarinet at this very traditional institution called the Westport School of Music in Westport, Connecticut. And somehow I got thrown out of there for being disobedient. And another guy got thrown out who was teaching there. He was a cellist, Eugene Friesen. He also was getting in trouble. I think I was like laughing at the wrong point in some event, but he was teaching too much improvisation. No, bad. So I got to meet him, and he said he was playing with Paul Winter. Like, oh, that sounds cool. And then that's how we met each other. And then I learned there was you could do that. You could combine music and an interest in nature. Although I didn't really do it so much for about 20 years. I didn't do that much in this area until later on I got to know another leading person in this area. As again, there's very few people known for this around the world, and that was R. Murray Schafer, a Canadian composer, who would compose music for like trombonists and cellists to be performed on a wilderness lake with opera singers wearing wolf masks and things, canoeing. And when he turned 60 years old, which is how old I am now, there was a big conference in 1993 for his birthday. And there I met the handful of people from around the world who were interested in combining music and nature. They all came, a few hundred people, to Banff in Canada to talk about this stuff. And that's where I met a lot of people that I learned a lot from in the coming decades. So it's worth going to these events, and there wasn't any internet back then, really, and wasn't much of it, at least. So you had to go to these places to convene and meet people and see what was going on. And one of the people I met there was an artist. Well, first of all, Murray Schafer, wrote so many great books. The most famous one is called The Tuning of the World, and then when it was republished, it was called The Soundscape, just about listening through history, how much sound had meant to humanity. And then he would compose these crazy pieces that just got crazier and crazier and crazier. And like one of his most, grand pieces is something called The Wolf Project, a piece that took 10 years to perform. It was like a cult. You signed up for The Wolf Project. You just had to be there 10 years every summer in the forest and getting more and more into it. And then it's a whole saga. And so, but he wanted to get people outside, and he passed away last year, I believe. He was in his 80s, and one quote I read about him, he was always just causing trouble, kind of cantankerous. He was sort of revered in Canada, but also they didn't know what to do with him. He was on some national committee. What should we do? I think in the 1990s again, or early 2000s. What should we do for the youth of Canada? And the government decided they were going to give every single teenager in Canada a computer, and then they would be so ready to solve the world's problems. Everyone thought, what a great idea if we could afford this, except for Murray Schafer. What a stupid idea. Well, what do you think we should do, Mr. Schafer? He said, I don't know, I think you should teach them all to carry a bucket of water on their heads. Walking like this, So he would do things like that. But anyway, back to the Murray Schafer 60th birthday conference. I met a guy named Michael Pestel, who was an art professor at the time at Chatham College, Pittsburgh, and he said, and by the time I hadn't spent much time playing live with animals, except like a little bit as a little kid, playing little flutes to birds. But then I sort of had taken recordings and tried to cut and paste them together, play with them. He goes, you got to come to the National Aviary in Pittsburgh and play with the birds there. America, not very well known, has a national aviary where they keep birds in Pittsburgh. And this is the very moment in the year 2000, the first time I think I was playing live with birds. That is actually me. This is what happened. Okay, it was like 6 in the morning. The place hadn't opened yet. I was walking around with the clarinet. Birds are making sounds. This bird is behind a net. You can't tell this, but you know he's in a sort of a caged area, but it's not a glass, but a net that is not in focus here, because things focused differently back in the year 2000. Little camcorders, right? Today's phone would have focused on everything. And so, okay, well, this bird seemed to be doing something interesting. Like, this is interesting. And you can learn a lot about animals by playing music with them. You can learn things. Everything I thought I knew about bird songs, for example, was not true with this species when I then looked it up afterwards. Anybody seen this bird before? Does it look familiar? So white-crested laughing thrushes are common in India and Southeast Asia. They're everywhere, different laughing thrushes. The interesting thing about this species, and there wasn't much written on this bird when I went to look up afterwards, but I did learn some interesting things, that the males and females both sing, and they're more like talking back and forth with these musical phrases. Because I had taken biology classes, as many of you have. You definitely have, where you learn that male birds are singing to attract a mate and defend their territories, and that's what they're doing. That's what they teach you in biology class. This bird doesn't do that. They talk back and forth. They want to know where their other half is, and they live in thick forests. They can't see anything, and various bird species do that, but not often in so musical a way. So the whole aesthetic or life world of this bird is very musical, and yet probably not too often people play music to them in the aviary. They might whistle to them back and forth and notice, oh, they kind of respond. But the idea that you could make music like this it's not seen as something you can just do. And so, I didn't think it was something you could just do either until I just did it, and this is kind of interesting. And look, it set me on this journey to learn about this bird. So today I'm going to mostly focus on examples where, times I've been playing live with sounds in nature, because that's what we're going to be doing in the coming days. So I'm going to skip over some stuff, but I do want to talk about the veery, a common bird where I live. They just start singing around now. That's what the song is. It's a song people often hear. They don't know what it is. This is not a famous bird, but I think the name is after the song. A lot of bird songs go by kind of fast. When you slow this down and pitch it down, it turns into this. This is just crazy. And this is probably the biggest discovery I felt I made, slowing down a bird song. It turned into this. This is an example of what is not in the biology textbooks. It's not just that birds, in biology, all bird song is the same. It's often the same function and purpose, different species, to attract a mate, to defend a territory. Why is each species so different? Why is the veery song sound so musical to us when slowed down? Nothing is said about that. Although we do, I don't know, in Slovenian, is there a word for bird song and bird call? Are they different words? Mm-hmm. What do you think? Yeah, what's the word for bird song?
I mean, we say it's singing versus oglašanje, making sounds.
Yeah, like many bird species, they have calls that are more like talking, more social, back and forth. And then the song is like this performance. And most human languages, not all, recognize this difference. That there's this kind of performance that's more like music. Okay, it turned out people had tried to document or understand what the veery was doing before in history. The top is from a book called The Field Guide to Wild Birds and Their Music from 1907 by someone named F. Schuyler Matthews. And this is both those things and how he tried to represent that veery sound. I'm very intrigued by that transcription, how he made it in 1907 without any way to slow the sound down. Did anybody know could you slow down recordings in 1907? I'm sure there were no recordings actually at that point of bird song, because that came a little later.
I mean, but you had this cylinder, wax cylinder that you could record basically anywhere.
But could you slow them down?
I don't know.
I don't know. The basic story is that nobody had recorded bird sounds until the 20s, until later. But so how did he get that transcription out of that's interesting. How did he do that? And it's sort of similar. And below is from the 1950s, a book, Field Guide to Wild Birds, where this guy, Aretas Saunders, he was a biologist, like an ornithologist. He invented this weird, like, Dadaist notation for the Veery song. Like, what is he talking about here? Like, it's good. But look at the double language. Like this is a scientist turned into a sound poet. And this is something that really interested me. Working on this stuff is like you're pushed to the edge of what you can understand. And there it kind of gets to be like improvisation. When you're making music, you can't quite explain what you're doing. I think most of us improvisers realize we can't explain what we're doing. I just tried to transcribe it in a normal way. I found this kind of boring, But I don't know if it's accurate. My friend Alexander Lieberman, he's become an Instagram celebrity with super accurate transcriptions of bird songs. And then he gets, incredibly well-trained classical musicians to play these things, like note for note. And he's like, you can look him up on Instagram. There's always a transcription and somebody playing it. But the fact is that the fact that it's like human music is interesting. This bird looks the same as the Veery, but is a lot more famous because its song is like this. Why do you think this bird's more famous? Because they look the same. It changes, each starting on a different pitch. And so much is written about this character. We're slowing him down a little bit more here. People who study these things have discovered birds can hear 5 times faster than we do. And these birds don't hear as wide a range of pitches as we do. They hear a smaller range. So they're not making sounds we can't hear with frequencies, but with time. They can hear all these things. But also the way their brains work, these specific sounds of their species mean much more to them than other sounds. Like they're keyed in. You can see what goes on in the brain of a Veery when he hears just that song. So the hermit thrush is written about by all American nature writers, poets, naturalists as the most mellifluous, beautiful, enigmatic. That's a call. That's a call. Like, hey, stop recording me. And I don't give you permission for this. So if you slow it down further, it becomes something I really want to play along with. And so this here, you've probably seen these things, a sound spectrogram or sonogram, where you print out the frequencies against time in different ways. And this is how today's scientists, instead of making up Dadaist language or using musical notation, the people studying birdsong only have printouts like this and say this is supposedly more accurate. If anyone wants to make these, we can make them later with sounds we record. You'll learn right away that sonograms are just as a matter of as much interpretation as transcription or playing or anything else. You adjust the parameters to see things you think are important. Do you look at 1 second? Do you look at 1 minute? Do you look at 10 minutes? You can learn a lot because people are so much more visual than oral, except maybe musicians, that you can understand complex things. Like I've looked at sonograms of like an hour of underwater pond sounds and heard things and saw things like organized bits of rhythm that I could never hear because some creature in the pond was making this sound every few minutes in an exact regular rhythm. And while I recorded, I didn't hear anything interesting. I couldn't understand anything until I saw it. And then I couldn't believe that was going on. I didn't notice it. But so here we have this further slowed down hermit thrush, the same thing, just slower. And so here, now you hear what's kind of interesting, enigmatic about this sound. And I'll just try and learn from it by playing along with it in this form. The thing about playing along with this is it always sounds like different. There's always a different thing you can do with this. This is like this endless material in just this one song. And so much has been discussed about hermit thrushes. And among biologists there's a debate, you can weigh in on this, an argument as to whether the hermit thrush uses scales of any kind. Are there scales in the song of this bird?
But in the end, it kind of sounded like the harmonics.
They're definitely using harmonics. Most musicians tend to say, of course, like it's using all these scales. And then so scientists say, no, we're just hearing that because we're people. And notice how everyone is at a different pitch, so there's no actual scale. And to me, I would say it's using intervals that are very organized, and the way it's organized is of the very aesthetic of this species. And if you want to understand this species, you have to figure that out. The fact that it's not a clear human scale that's steady through the whole piece is totally irrelevant. That doesn't matter. But if you understand a scale as a series of notes, and a relationship between them, then sure. But in what sense does that matter? It matters like, what is it that's actually musical about what these animals are doing? What counts as music when you find it in the natural world? And that's something we'll be thinking about as we go along. Okay, I'm feeling like we should... Okay, here's what I'd like to play live with birds at dawn. This is something I did 2 years ago. And to do this, we had to start when it was totally dark, before dawn. This is down the street from my house. All the little pieces of equipment we used. So then it gets into the whole idea of playing along with whole environments. How does one think about music with different sounds around you? That's a catbird. A red-winged blackbird. That's the catbird going meow, meow. And the cardinal is a common bird, the one bird where I live where the males and females both sing, like the laughing thrush. Again, something most people don't know about that, unless you bring it up and say, go listen to them, listen to what they're doing. This one, maybe a Carolina wren. The idea of like musically making sense of whole environments, like dawn choruses, is something that biology is just starting to think about now, because they like the idea of using a lot of data to analyze it. The kind of computers can listen to all the sounds and conclude things about it. As musicians, you can go and play with it all and see if it makes sense. We have motorcycles and trucks here. It's important. The sound includes humans, which I think is important to recognize. But it's much more diffuse than dealing with like an individual bird like we started with. Okay, we're going to skip the insects for now. Well, we can do it later, although they're interesting. We're going to move on to whales. Well, this is my favorite sonogram. I'll play you this one thing. What do you think that's going to sound like? Yeah, good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is one cicada, a certain kind, like the dog day cicada. Luckily, the 17-year cicadas, when you have millions of them around, they're not individually so loud. But this is a sense in one image, like, this kind of sonogram, you might not like the sound, but you stretch it out so it's just a few seconds, and you can sense the way it starts, how the sound changes. It's like a musical thing. The sound is shaped and formed exactly. Interesting, of course, cicadas can't even hear this. They just sort of feel it in a kind of more simplified ways. So here you have this animal making this really interesting sound it can't even perceive. But this shows you so much going on that you don't know you couldn't transcribe it. You don't know what to say about it. You kind of it's this visually, it just shows you all the things that's there, okay? Yeah, and these are the 17-year ones. When you can hear them, if anyone's interested in the phenomenon of 17-year cicadas, in 2024, the 13-year and 17-year ones are going to overlap in the same place. There's going to be more cicadas than in any other time in this century, and it's going to be in this area. I think this is only 17-year ones, not 13-year ones. But I was there, or maybe it was 13-year ones. No, this is, anyway, they're going to be overlapping. Because when I was, in 2011, when I started this insect research, I wanted, in Missouri, I was waiting to get some cicada ice cream they claimed they would serve, but there was a poster saying, "We're out, come back in 2024. So that was 13 years. Okay, but we can go later to this very interesting bug stories. Sing, fly, mate, die. And let's go to whales. Okay, so after I wrote a book called Why Birds Sing, where it talked about this music with birds and talked about how different forms of human knowledge say different things about different animals. Like biology says this, poetry says this about birdsong, music says this. They're all different valid ways of learning about the world. One isn't more accurate than any others. Science will often say we're objective and everything else is subjective. But I think, I kind of feel that's not really true. It's just another human way to imagine. We measure the world, that's what's really there. Everything is atoms, everything is data. This is objective, and people talking about songs being beautiful, that's somehow subjective. But I think counting everything is just as equally humanly subjective. Maybe nature isn't made up of the things we measure. Like maybe it's just like William James said, it was a booming, buzzing confusion. Maybe certain cultures, ways of seeing the world, everything flows from one to another. There are no objects. There's just, affordances, or something is calling, like something orange. It's not necessarily an orange curtain. It's orange and green. And then the object is something we interpret out of it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's like they're all different human ways of deciding what the world's made up of. Certainly the whales are not thinking in these terms, and they make these sounds. But at this bird book, was probably the most successful of projects I've done. And then I wanted to do another book. I said, I want to talk about songs of whales. And, I mentioned this to the publisher. They said, what do you mean, whales? Like, they have songs. Haven't you heard of whale songs? Oh, yeah, I've heard of whale songs. But did you know nobody knew about them until the 1950s and 1960s? And so I wanted to study what happened when people discovered there was a sound where they previously thought there was no sound. And I wanted to play live with whales because I'd heard all this music made with recordings of whales. Couldn't you go play live with them with a speaker and a microphone? Yeah, you could do it. Doesn't always work. This is a fragment of hours and hours of whale clarinet interactions.
It's almost like wolves.
Exactly. It's very wolf-like. In this iteration, if you go longer into the structure of wolf howls and whale songs, they get more different. And it turns out like the humpback whale song is a lot more like a nightingale song than like a wolf howl because of the way it's structured, things that were found out. So this is how you do it. I'm not going to show you this. Watch it later. And we were just back doing this in March. Last time I went was 2019. I went back with a bunch of friends, people interested in this, including this Dutch musician and this filmmaker who had so much fancy equipment. We have so much material from this trip. Everything, we have way fancier underwater speakers than that, like all kinds of fancy stuff. And most of it did work. Our boat almost sunk one day, but otherwise things were working. It was just starting to sink. And I wasn't so worried, but the people with the cameras were worried. Yeah. Nothing was damaged. Okay, it's true that nobody knew about whale song until the 1950s. And here we have Roger Payne, famous whale scientist. That's not a humpback whale, but a gray whale. And this is what the whale song sounds like on its own. This is the way it is, with background noise taken out. It sounds like cows or farts or things like that on its own, but once you, at this scale, you just hear the noises, but when you look at the whole song, you realize how structured it really is. And in 1971, Roger Payne and Scott McVeigh, they published this article and made the cover of Science, most impressive science journal in America, Songs of Humpback Whales. And this was the cover. It's like some weird artwork. And to make a sonogram then, you had to use thermal paper, and once it printed out, it would start to die. In a few weeks, it would just be all black, or in a few months. And so they traced it over, put down tracing paper, and you trace over the patterns. And each line is about a minute. It took a long time for that to be printed out, hours. And then only when they had printed it out did they understand there was a real structure here that was very surprising, that made it really seem like music. And even more unusual with what they wrote in the paper, they said the humpback whale emits a series of surprisingly beautiful sounds, which I've often asked Scott McVeigh, who I got to know after this, why did you say that? That doesn't sound like science. What do you mean beautiful? Can you prove it? He just sort of laughed. It's like, we didn't worry about stuff like that then. There's no other scientific paper on the songs of humpback whales that mentions anything being beautiful since this one. And I've asked the authors of other papers, do you like the songs? Are they beautiful? Oh, no, Payne and McVeigh said that. We don't have to say that. It's been said. Exactly. So what you learn there is that the structures, hand-drawn sonograms, which in a way look a lot nicer than the computer ones. You can learn to sing this. These are harder. And then this. Yeah, but it's all here. The other day, somebody wrote a dissertation on this in musicology at NYU when I was on the committee. And you might say big deal, but there's so few, hardly anyone has written a musicological dissertation on humpback whales. I believe several people are working on them now. Heather Woodson Gammon may have been the first one to complete her dissertation. And then in the committee meeting, I was the one who said the important thing here is you can perform these songs. So I was going whoop, 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 in front of all these people, and these other musicologists were like sitting there, like, this is it. We've written it down. You can perform these, and but all this is in that paper. They identified the structure, how these things are put together, and it's the structure that makes it seem especially musical, the way it's performed over and over and over again, and not so much like talking where you don't say the same thing over and over again. The message has gotten across. A lot of weird things came out about these whale songs. They changed from year to year. Bird songs don't tend to do this. Or when there's variation in bird song, every individual bird wants to be different. Which birds around here are like that? Wants to say, I'm singing this way and you're not. What species? Nightingales do that. Who else? Blackbirds, yeah, is a very... Blackbird song is actually a little bit like this. They extend it, they change it as the season goes up, like this. During one season, a blackbird song is going to evolve. At the end of the season, their songs are better or more developed than at the beginning. The individuals. And they tend to start again each year. They kind of develop it differently. That's been studied a bit, and it's very interesting, and no American bird is quite like that. But these whales are changing much more rapidly than people thought they should. But the other interesting thing, those of interested in music and nature, is this was discovered by the Navy, the American Navy, in the 1950s. They put all these underwater hydrophones, underwater microphones, because they wanted to listen to enemy submarines coming from Russia, and perhaps also Slovenia might have been making things for Russian submarines back then. Who knows? And they heard all kinds of weird sounds. And they were quite disappointed to learn they came from whales and fish. And I've read these books, and there's even one that says, biologists tell us these sounds are made by whales, but we're not so sure. We should still be vigilant, keep listening to them, and especially don't tell anyone about this. This is classified information through the 50s and 60s, and they didn't know what to do with these. The people recording them said, oh, they're so cool, whales are making them, and Frank Watlington, he gave these recordings to Payne and McVeigh and said, you guys figure out what's going on here. And then they decided we really should tell everyone about this, and they released this album, Songs of the Humpback Whale, that looked like this on the cover. And then inside was a 48-page booklet in English and Japanese, maybe also Russian, about how we should really stop killing these whales because they sing these beautiful songs. That might be obvious to us now, but it wasn't then, and even environmentalists didn't talk about whales. Whales were not on people's radar. And it was the song that had this influence. And Scott McVeigh went to Japan with a bunch of records and played these songs on national television for whaling executives, and then who would sometimes burst into tears, like, we just didn't know about these beautiful songs. And there's this song that started Greenpeace, started activism to save whales. So music in nature saved humpback whales, saved whales enough so by 1986, the international moratorium on whaling was enacted. So now there's just a few countries that hunt whales, like Iceland, Norway, Japan, Russia. And in the United States, if you're indigenous people, can kill whales. But they often don't manage to catch them. So, yeah, so I mentioned this because it's like music in nature can help people care about nature. And there's a lot of that being thought about now with birds. Also around the same time was this movement of consciousness, like kind of like we're all one with nature. Dolphins are so smart, whales are so smart, we can interact with them and thereby save the planet. This book, Mind in the Waters, points out, it has articles by scientists and kind of new agey spirituality types. It's artwork where people in Wales are living in harmony. I don't know what this is. This is the best picture in the book. It's just like... And then you laugh, but today, gray whales off Baja, California, they come up, they show their babies to people, they're mating right in front of people. Humpback whales don't do that. No one's ever seen a humpback whale give birth or mate. We don't know what's going on. Only males are making those songs, so biology says, it's to attract the attention of female whales. So 50, 60 years we've been studying this. No one's ever seen a female whale show any interest in this behavior whatsoever. Maybe it's about something else. But anyway, Mind in the Waters, there's several articles by scientists where they insert poems. They talk about how they're playing instruments to whales. all of those same scientists, the ones still around today, they didn't even mention they did stuff like that. This is the 1970s. It was a more open time. But in Hawaii, you can find people on whale watching. These are not official. These are like the unofficial whale watching journeys where people are singing and playing along with whales and take off their clothes, break out the didgeridoo, stick it in the water, and the whales are swimming around. And then you jump in the water. This is totally illegal. You know, approach the whale like this. But and then it's like a continuation of the notion of people and whales together in some spiritual, musical, harmonic vibe. And, you know, when I was working on this book, we were all naked on boats taking out our instruments and things. It doesn't really happen so much anymore now, 16, 17 years later. But, okay, we're going to skip this part and talk a little about nightingales, and then we're going to ask you questions, because what this is all about is how to make these sonograms more accessible to people. This is like a revised version. The sonogram moves. It's like a video, so you hear the structure. It's the structure that makes it more musical. This whale, by the way, is actually singing at this speed. It's not sped up. You know, yeah. When sonograms were invented, it was generally thought that people thought this could help the deaf learn to speak. If you couldn't hear, if you could see the sound, you might be able to learn how to make the sound if you don't hear it. That's one of the reasons that it was promoted as a scientific, useful invention. The standard story is that it never really worked. But I showed this video at a talk like this, and someone came up afterwards and said, hey, you know, I teach music to the deaf in the Dominican Republic. I know we have humpback whales there. I know you said this isn't supposed to work, but if I showed this to my students, they'd all be singing with whales in like 2 minutes. They would get it right away. I go, yeah, let's go try that. So we went and did this. We took these like deaf teenagers out in this boat with the whales. They're underwater, and they'd already been studying these diagrams, and he's feeling the sound in the speaker, you know. And it worked pretty well, it's probably easier to use sonograms to teach people who can't hear the structure and power of whale songs than language, maybe. To teach music this way rather than language. Interesting, this kid never made any sound. Like, he had never gone to school because he lived in this remote village where they decided it was too dangerous for a deaf kid to be in school. But when he heard these sounds, he was just like, when he saw it, when he understood it, ooh, you can make these not quite language type sounds, and everyone goes, yeah. It's like, okay. Yeah. The parents are more worried about seasickness. We're going back to this. Okay, so that was the direction, like, I didn't expect this work to ever go, to show that the sonogram actually would work. That it making sound visual makes something, if you can't hear, it still makes sense. And it's a structure that makes these things possibly musical. So when we go out and hear sounds in nature, what turns it into music? We can think about that. I mean, of course, today any sound could be music. You know, what's the definition of music today? Is someone tells you it's music. Listen to this. I'm sure most of us have been to these weird concerts where some sound is coming, you don't know what it is, and someone's saying it's music. Okay. You know, it's music if someone tells you it is. I went to college and music was organized sound, which seems like a very bad definition. Certainly these birds and whales are organizing sound, at least that much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Nightingales in Berlin project. I think it's 2013 I decided I spent a year on sabbatical from teaching in Berlin because I had heard that this city was actually full of these singing birds. Nightingales I had heard before and always wondered why they sounded so different from the way I imagined they would from reading about them in Shakespeare and romantic poetry. And I knew in Berlin scientists were studying them. Each of these birds has a different number and name, and they have different characteristics, and they come back to the same exact spot every year. They migrate to Africa and come back to the same tree. Like I know bird number 7 is a good one, you know. By now it's enough years, it's probably a different bird, but that's a good place to hear them in this park. And so you all heard nightingales, right? If I play this in America, no one's ever heard them, and when they hear this, they go, what? Because they imagine nightingales would be more like European blackbirds, like mellifluous and melodic, not like this weird kind of electronic. This sound, that's considered the sexiest sound, one study in Berlin, which determined females really like that one sound and would kind of get very excited when they heard it. And so the biologist who wrote the paper said, why doesn't the bird then just repeat that sound over and over again? That scientist hadn't really thought enough about music, because in music you can't use your best effects too much, because then it doesn't have the same effect. You have to use it just the right amount of times. Totally crazy. So it's not like a way we think humanly of structuring music or understanding music, but the way to understand the music of these birds is to understand what they like, what they're thinking, how the musicality fits into their culture. And this led me to work with some scientists to try and figure this out. So this is together with Tina Roske, as a biologist at the Max Planck Institute of Empirical Aesthetics, which actually exists. It sounds like something out of science fiction, but they have empirical aesthetics in Germany, which means we measure the beautiful. We don't just say a series of beautiful sounds, we measure it. So what are they doing?
Isn't that like seeing in German?
It is, yeah. But even there, they think it's pretty crazy. Yeah, put it in. But so this is some science here. So she made these pictures. I don't know how to make these cool diagrams, but basically, dark blue is silent, red is like really loud, studying amplitude in this picture. And you can like line up all the separate phrases when it's quiet, when there's a sound. And then you can slide them together like this. And then in one picture you can have 6,000 sounds. Isn't that crazy? It's like big data. 6,000 songs in the order as sung, and it's clustered by similarity. This is the kind of thing you can do in science, but you could do the same thing with phrases from Beethoven or something, da-da-da-da, and line them all up, and 6,000 Beethoven phrases. How are they clustered? And then how did they sing? How did they move? Well, they go from here, the order as they sing the different phrases. And there's different birds sort of have slightly different characteristics, how they move from one sound to the next. But she was disappointed with this study. Too many of and when analyzed like this, everything was the same as random. Yeah. She wasn't too pleased. But another study, this is a different study, the same study scientist who talked about, the sexiest sound. She goes, there are orderly birds and disorderly birds. The orderly birds, they're always singing their different phrases, and they know several hundred of them in the same order, and other ones like all over the place. Maybe this is the composer versus the improviser. I don't know. It just shows how hard it is to figure out what's going on. And then we wrote a paper about this, combining. And it actually came out of something in my book, Why Birds Sing. Back in 2005, I said, scientists are asking the wrong questions about birdsong. They're not trying to take it seriously as music, and they could measure that stuff if they wanted to. And Ofer Chernikovsky said, okay, let's do it. You think we should do this? Most scientists were angry that I was just criticizing them and not knowing what I was talking about. But he said, let's just do it. So we spent like 5 years doing different versions of this, and then published this paper and led it over to Tina's other research. And this, I wouldn't say I'm a scientist, and he made me the first author, because it's all your idea. We wasted all this time. Your name down. But later, Tina wrote a more conclusive paper called Birds Have Swing, Multifractal Analysis Reveals Expressive Rhythm in Birdsong. And this is about one part of the nightingale song. And she analyzed those, and they're not exactly like a machine. They're like just as irregular as if a human is playing like fast rhythms. You have to do it right. Like if you're going to play this piece, you probably play this if you play piano. Did you ever play this? We don't care about him. But the Earl King, Schubert, right? You've got to you can't play it like a machine. Your teacher will say, you sound like a machine. You have to have some unevenness, some human, we would call human emotional quality. And it turns out you can measure that, and the nightingales do the same thing when they're going. That turned out to be an interesting result, because it shows you can actually measure these musical things. So we're maybe out of time, but the main thing that I was interested in is not these analyses, although they're kind of fun, but actually going out and playing live with the birds on various instruments. And what I liked to do, you can sample them. Korhan Erel is sampling them. You can sample the birds live and see how they respond. They do recognize you're doing something really weird. When you copy them exactly and change the pitch, change the speed live, they go, what? You know. And then we made a film about this, Nightingales in Berlin. There's a book and a film and lots of released music. And I really wanted to film what happened when he brought people out to do this for the first time. Because they get like, it surprises us. There it is.
It's the first time I sang with birds and nightingales in particular. At the end, when you get really into it, you feel like flying actually.
Okay, we can watch the whole thing later. You can watch it online. And all kinds of musicians are brought in, all kinds of instruments, and all kind of pushing towards what can you do as a human being interacting with this whole world of animal sound. So that's what we're going to be doing in the coming days. I don't know where and how we're going to do it, but we can do all these things. Thanks for listening. Anyone have any questions? Any?
Have you worked with seals?
Like seals in the water? I have not. I know a little bit about the kinds of sounds that they make.
Very much like synthesizer. Like
some of them, yeah. Yeah, especially in Weddell seals in Antarctica, they sound like outer space noises, yeah. Yeah, I would like to work with them. I know the seals in captivity have learned all sorts of sounds. Some of them just say words and they can imitate things. So, and again, that's not something they do in the wild, but they have a lot of, animals have a lot of abilities that aren't tested in their normal lives, so. Are any seals around here? In the zoo, right? The aquarium, right?
No.
Yeah.
I think you have to see.
Yeah.
In the zoo, there are a couple.
There might be.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of birds, use sound different ways. They don't sing; they have calls. A lot of. Once you start to look and listen for music, in the environment, in the world around, you hear all kinds of different things as being musical. It kind of depends on what you're listening for and what you think music is or can be, and how it relates to the place in which it's performed. What's most interesting to me, what's most interesting in these kinds of musical journeys is how it makes me start to get interested in different kinds of sounds. Like I left out the insect section. When I started thinking about bugs and music, then I started hearing different kinds of human sounds as being more musical than I previously realized. Like it got me much more interested in electronic sounds, listening to bugs. And I started to realize that maybe electronic music actually descends from our interest in insect sounds, because these sounds have been around long before there was any human music. There were cicadas and crickets, and all kinds of these noises that people enjoyed and recognized and loved, and they were very different than human music, but we appreciated them. And then when we made instruments that made these sounds, it's like, okay, now we're entering into the world of insectness, insect things. So, yeah.
Do you think that there is a problem if a musician is trying to musically interact with the bird, and the bird is actually producing calls and not singing?
Yeah, what are they actually thinking? Like sometimes, I mean, there's the biggest problems I've had is that, a lot of people do this, they don't quite get it. They're not open to a lot of musicians would come and play their own music in this new context. Why not? And that's fine. You could just play Bach outside. It's nice. And that they, I'm more interested in how people might change their music in this context to do something they didn't think they would do. But not everyone does that. Some just perform their own things. It's a certain kind of musician that's open to something they've never done before, or willing to let their music change. And that's why a lot of improvisers are good at it. But some classical musicians say, okay, I'm going to change this piece because there's birds. And some of you might know the world's first outdoor radio broadcast was a cellist and a nightingale, Beatrice Harrison, in the 1920s in England. But back then it was a big deal to broadcast anything from out of doors. All this BBC loved all this equipment so that they could broadcast to the world a cellist playing with a nightingale in her garden. And it became so popular they did it every year until World War II. This cellist, this nightingale, and it's like it's more and more is written about this now. There's all these biographies, all these studies, all these debunkers, people claiming it wasn't a nightingale, it was my great uncle, he was a bird impersonator, he was there, and like the stories go on and on. You just, but the fact that the first outdoor radio broadcast was not from a sporting event, it wasn't a political rally, it was a cellist and a nightingale. It tells you something about human interest in nature. And it's still like a radical thing to do. It's still people go, wow, you could do this. And it doesn't have to be this rare or hard to find species. It can be a very normal place. It can be right around wherever you are. It just means taking seriously what's sort of right around you in a different way, like just taking it in.
And in that sense, when you play, because you spoke of the way birds hear is in a narrower frequency range than we hear. And do you consciously choose to play in that same region, or?
It's a good question. I mean, the short answer is no. Like I imagine like the birds and me, the whales and me, we're making a music together that neither species could make alone. So we're making something like, who's it for? I don't know. Everyone hears it a different way. Like I'll play music for an audience of deaf students who can't hear it, but they're hearing it a different way because they can feel rhythms in a way that matters more to the way I would feel those rhythms, because I'm also hearing. Or cicadas are a perfect example. They're making all this noise and they don't even hear it.
What?
Like cicadas. Yeah, like they can't hear those sounds that they make. They feel them in this kind of more simplified way. And there's a lot, the more we learn about animal sound, the more examples there are like that. Animals making sounds they themselves cannot perceive. So you wonder, what's it for exactly?
We just hear the bleed.
Yeah.
The sound bleed.
Yeah. Things like that. And I feel like that I'm making the music together for some musical goal that isn't for either species, because either species isn't used to this, I mean, humans take everything in, we use stuff. But do the nightingales care that people are with them making sounds? The simple answer is, we're bothering them, we should get out of their way, they don't need us. On the other hand, nightingales in Berlin and Ljubljana, are perfectly fine being in the city. Would they rather be in the wilderness? I don't know. Unclear. It's like we're all in it together. And so, I sometimes, usually I'm not thinking specifically of what to do for the animals, but I know some people who do think in those ways. Like,
I thought of it for the sake of interaction.
Yeah.
Like and frequency range is just one possible parameter to pay attention to. I don't know. For sure there are plenty others that would get more interaction or more response from the birds.
Right.
And from that point of view, I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that many researchers believe that for animals, rhythm is more important than pitch.
Okay.
Rhythms often get more specific reactions. Of course, if we think we're playing a low note, the high frequencies can be heard by animals that hear high frequencies. Like if you play something and you find your dog is howling along, they're picking up on different things.
So they just get the harmonics of the note.
They might be, yeah. Just like, we're hearing sounds that, sometimes some whale species are lower than we can hear. Although most of them are. The humpback whale is similar to human range. But more interestingly is like, some whale species just make a fin whale, like 32 hertz, just this boom. But every 2 minutes they do
Some of
it.
them go down as low as 8 hertz, I think.
Possibly, yeah. These really low things.
Because it extends the range of communication. I think there was an article that showed that because they have the ability to go like from 8 hertz up to something like 200, 300, but if they opt to speak or make sounds, calls in that low frequency spectrum, they can extend their communication range up to something like 2,000, 3,000 kilometers.
That's why the book is called 1,000 Mile Song, about that idea. But whether they actually do it is unclear. You have to be at a certain depth, but the notion of whales communicating over thousands of miles is essential for our interest in what it's all about. And like a fin whale, makes just like one whoop, and then 2 minutes later another one. And if you speed it up, it's going to be one of those regular rhythms, like. So do they hear it as a beat? Do they hear the rhythm? Do they hear that slowly? It's fascinating to imagine they might, And that's the other reason this is so talked about, is this makes the idea useful to like the military that's funded this research. The deep sound channel, we can use this to communicate over long distances. If we produce a sound that low in the ocean, and I've talked to people who worked on this research. They say, yeah, the whales are doing it. We've heard it, but like they haven't really proven this. It's just like part of the whole mythos of long range communicate. It does work, but they're often singing higher up, closer to the surface, especially when we usually hear them. But it's a great, vision of communication and the notion of the slowed down rhythm. But think of the slowest rhythm, in animal sounds is the 17 years of cicada. Like they can actually count. How do they know when to come up?
Nobody knows.
Well, we know that they respond to the temperature fluctuations. If you put a cicada underground and make it cold, warm 17 times faster, then they'll come up early. We don't know how exactly, they register that, but they do.
But this is bioclock or how it's...
Yeah,
biorhythm.
Right, yeah.
It's a biorhythm.
Of course,
it's a
yeah,
biorhythm,
right. But then it's like sound. It's like you're playing French horn in a Broadway musical, and you have to wait several hours and play another note.
So does this then mean that because we have what's the official term? Is it flocks of cicadas? No, it's something else.
No, you have
You know what I mean? Like a singular group which appears periodically.
Brood. It's called a brood.
A brood, yeah, exactly.
That's
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah.
So if we have broods that appear at regular intervals, I think most of them are prime numbers, right?
Yeah.
This also that, and you said they respond mostly to temperature fluctuations. This then implies that there are highly time-specific temperature fluctuations locally. For example, in the U.S.
Only in the U.S. has this kind of periodicity been found.
Because if they wouldn't be this periodic, we wouldn't know them as the 13-year brood.
Right, but
the
the reason for that evolving is debated, and there are various explanations, but the most convincing one to me has to do with uneven glaciation. That when the ice melted, you just imagine it melted. Just one place was free for like a few hundred years, and then all kinds of stuff happened there. And the cicadas all cicadas take at least several years to come out. Like the ones, do you get a lot of them here or not so much? every year.
Not in Ljubljana, but every year.
What, do some years have more than others? Usually,
Yeah.
yeah. And so they have their own cycle, but it's not so clear. It's not as defined. But one a bit of research of mathematical biology shows like why prime numbers. That doesn't make any sense. One argument you read is they're competing against predators that have more regular cycles, but there are no predators like that of these cicadas. The ecological strategy is to outnumber whatever predators. Nobody can make a dent in the population. You can see animals just getting sick and throwing up. They've eaten too many of them. There's just more, so they win. But if they're competing against themselves and come out, if you do like a mathematical biology chart, the prime numbers will win out, and then maybe just a few populations are left. But that's like game theory biology. Like it's all theory, we don't know. But it's kind of cool idea. Why just 13 and 17? It's totally crazy.
It's all getting more computational in biology. Anyway.
Right. Yeah, this is a good topic for that. But we don't really know. It's a Japanese scientist who came up with this theory about America. In Japan and China, they love insects. So Japanese biologists show up in America. I've run across some of these characters. Again, it's a small group of people studying this amazing phenomenon. And then, it's always, kind of a surprise and this moment to hear. But you can also look at the behavior of cicadas as a musical strategy. Like several species come out in every brood. And one species called Magicicada septendecim. They all look the same. They just make different sounds. And this one goes like, an individual one goes pharaoh, pharaoh, and then you have millions of them. You just hear boom. It's like a drone. And the other species goes, and that one's called Magicicada cassini. So together they all like it's like a noise. But to distinguish themselves, they have this wave-like behavior. So they sing for a bit, and they all fly up, and then all synchronized, go out of the tree and down. You watch them fly and come down, and it ends up with this sound that goes against the drone, and so the species tell each other can separate each other. So it's a musical strategy. You hear this music going on, these two basic sounds, and there's a third species that goes like. They're synchronizing in rhythm, and they all look almost identical. And they all have to tell each other apart somehow. Why did this even happen? It's like a musical evolution. The three sounds evolved. So you hear something that at first just sounds like noise, and you start to listen to it, you hear the three different parts. It's like an orchestra. Millions of participants. I mean, it's totally there. You could just grasp this. And unlike most other animals you're looking for, millions of cicadas around, you can find one doing what you want to hear. It's right there. Pick this one up. We're here. And they're just not afraid. The annual cicadas are high in the trees, and it's hard to catch one. But the periodic cicadas, there's millions everywhere. Here's a male, here's a female. This one's doing this, this one's doing that. It's like nature interaction paradise. You can just collect a bunch of males. Like, this one's making sound. No, we don't want you. And take them, put them in a butterfly enclosure, and take them on stage and have them perform and such. Like you can like. But yes, so 2024, we're going. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I would really need to leave now.
That's okay. Sorry to keep you.
But maybe just
But,
for the
yeah.
Saturday.
Saturday.
Yeah. What's happening? I don't know. Where are we meeting? When? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that we meet here, of
Mhm.
course, and the weather is going to be approximately quite okay. But if you would like to go somewhere else.
Oh, we could go outside. It's kind of outside. Things can be done anywhere. You can find sounds of interest. So we can. We'll figure that out.
I have a bit of a bad instrument, so
Uh-huh.
I usually play piano. So,
Uh-huh.
but I mean, I also like to sing, so I can
Uh-huh.
also.
I got this whole special keyboard for this pianist to play with cicadas live. Angelica Sanchez, she was going to come on one of these things in Princeton, New Jersey. There were millions of cicadas, so I got this small MIDI keyboard, but still with like 61 key Bluetooth keyboard to play into the iPad to play electronic type sounds. But she never showed up, so I still have that keyboard. I've used it. That's one solution. To
get yourself
yeah.
a melodica,
Yeah.
perhaps.
You can,
that could also be.
You can, but also you can, melodica is good. We've used that with nightingales. And
Okay.
so
I
but
will
you could,
then bring something portable.
you could if you had a MIDI keyboard, we could plug it into something, or you could sing, or
Okay.
you could, or you know do anything, you know.
Maybe just a question because
Yeah.
about the car.
Yeah.
You can come by car on Saturday and maybe do a drive
I
or
have
a car.
Mhm.
Because just to know that Saturday is a kind of walking event in Ljubljana. We celebrate walking around. Yeah.
Also, now on this Saturday.
This Saturday.
Uh-huh.
It's gonna be full
That's
of,
somebody else's event. You mean? Oh no, it's about walking in general. Like
It's not about walking
It's
generally.
basically
it's
the
about
like walk down the
surrounding
path
me.
of remembrance.
I see.
Comradeship. It's to
Exactly.
do with the events of World War II.
Oh yeah.
So just to know that
Uh-huh.
if we're going somewhere else, very close, we will meet people. Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of
Is it a
people.
particular path?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is.
Like
Like
the
it's
path of
mapped out.
remembrance.
It's a mapped out.
And they want to
path
make sure
of-
not to do it on May 9th
Exactly,
when
just
Russians
not
are
to
doing
go
it.
there and maybe to find some other place, but maybe it's
Uh,
nice if you can come by car.
Yeah.
Do you drive? You have a car?
Yeah.
Maybe just.
Yeah, we can figure that. We can figure that out. Yeah.
Because we cannot fit into one car.
Yeah, I've done many events like that where you come on the wrong day. Like for the Nightingale concerts, the first time we did it, we decided it was going to be May 9th in Trep Tower Park, which we had forgotten. Like this is the Russian War Memorial.
Yeah.
You know, like thousands of Russians were there. We're just like sitting there. You know, that's how the book begins. Like sitting at some kiosk arguing with these Russians about the war, and waiting for the Nightingales. But at midnight, everyone left, and then the birds started to sing.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
when
So
we
you
say
will have
10 o'clock,
4 hours, right?
Hmm.
I think.
What?
The workshop is 4
Yeah, 4
hours.
hours.
And if we want to go to
Yeah,
some
yeah.
particularly nice natural place and we decide where it is, we can go
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah.
You
I
can
will
pick
think
a
about
place.
this and we can-
And yeah, we can do different things. I can bring the hydrophone and we can listen to pond sounds. I left that part out, but we, you know, but there's a lot to. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
this walking path is close to the
Yeah, that
festival,
goes
so
right
it's
around
not-
it actually.
But
Yeah,
we
you're
will
right. Yeah.
discuss about
We'll figure it out.
Can I just ask
Yeah,
one more
sure, of
question
course, yeah.
about because you made me think of something when you were slowing down the bird calls, right?
Yeah.
Sorry. So the thing is, I presume you're familiar with the idea of changed temporal perceptions in animals based on their like metabolic rates, right?
Right.
Wouldn't it then make sense for the birds to actually hear their calls anyway in that speed or that pitch kind of relative, the way that we heard it when you slowed it down, you know? Because like
That's one of the ideas, yeah.
because they have a faster metabolic
Yeah,
rate, they
yeah.
process sound probably much more slowly
Five-
than
That's the idea that they can hear 5 times faster than us.
yeah,
So
like
that-
that.
and
And
with-
same with
yeah.
insects, right?
Do they hear? I haven't heard that
Because, I mean,
research
it's been
done.
proven
Yeah.
that they process info more quickly. Hence, for example, the proven theory behind why a fly or a mosquito can so easily escape you slapping it on yourself or something, right?
Yeah.
Fly, I see you.
Yeah.
Is supposedly because they have a much faster perception.
Why you can't catch the fly?
Exactly. Except the chopsticks.
Right,
But
yeah.
anyway,
You have to
but-
fool them, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and apparently the way to fool insects or animals of such constitution, of such metabolic rate, is to move very slowly, because their
That's
time
good.
perception is slowed down so much that if you move the hands towards them very slow, they won't notice it, because the change is too slow and too subtle. But this processing could maybe also apply to how they perceive their calls.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something there. You know, the 17-year cicadas, they don't just make all these sounds. They have this complicated ritual between the males and females, more complicated than any other insect, where the male has to make a series of sounds. And what matters most was discovered by John Cooley, who figured this out. You know, that is the timing between when the male cicada stops a call, Pharaoh, and the female flicks her wings, makes a sound, and it just in an exact number of milliseconds after the male stops singing, then he goes on to the second call, and then on to the third call, and he's been able to perfect the timing just because he's studying this. Like he has this, he can make a cicada start to mate with a light switch, making this flicking noise. He carries around this light switch. He's the only one who can do it reliably because he's just got the timing right. He's practiced so much this one musical idea. When you hear barrel, and he flicks the switch, and you can learn to do it, but he's the best at it because he spent years just studying this. It's like practicing an instrument. But getting the timing right is for the cicadas. Humans aren't going to notice this difference. Nobody cares. But he's figured out they notice. It's like playing a game.
And maybe a bit infected with this way of thinking and interest in insects and everything, because we have a professor at my faculty, which is like really obsessed with insect perception and like with all the quirky things about.
Who is that?
Gregor Belušić. So he's an ex-journalist at Radio Student, where he worked in the scientific and the music department, and he's like a somewhat accomplished jazz guitarist, I think. But he has a huge interest in mostly insect vision. He worked with the Japanese on like some projects regarding butterfly vision, stuff like that. And he studies, he regularly attends conferences abroad about how their brains are wired differently.
Right. Let's see if he was. In 2011, I went to this big conference when I was researching this bug music book. This conference about insect sound and vibration communication, and there was a Slovenian there. Might have been him. Maybe? I'll look up and find out who it was. Who came up and talked to me and told me about this Slovenian musician who, Perovcek, who made this really interesting music out of insect sounds, and that he came up after my presentation and said you really should listen to this guy, and his music was very interesting and very connected to like the actual sounds,
We also have a guy at the Museum of Natural History here in Ljubljana, which only specializes in making like sound libraries of insects.
We should listen to those. The other thing that was very interesting about this 2011 conference is there's so many insects, so people gave up to give a talk about the communication of their species. Absolutely no one else in the world knew anything about these species that people were talking about because there's so many other species. I remember one woman, I think she was Russian, she was like so excited speaking about this species of fly and the sounds it made, and everyone else is like, they're interested, but there's something else. But I have to say the insect science world was far more interested in having musicians come and talk to them. Bird scientists would never invite me because they kind of think it's like opposed to their way of seeing things. And also at the official dinner of this conference, they had a musical performance by all the participants. It was, everyone stand up and make the sound of your study species.
Oh, wow.
And so they had like 200 people making all these sounds. And because they were all doing something so different. And that's an amazing thing when you try and confront nature as a human being. There's so many things going on. And even the most common birds and insects, you can discover things about them that we just can't explain what we don't know. Like, around in America, and I'd probably not here, but other places, you have fireflies that communicate like rhythmic things of light. And they start out being uneven, and then after a while they all synchronize together exactly. And they do that by following this kind of specific mechanism of just trying to get closer to another blink. Just like crickets, how they synchronize, they try and just get closer to a sound that's near them. Except one place in Tennessee, out of silence, all of a sudden they begin synchronized. No one has any idea how they do that. People travel from all around the world to witness this one place in Tennessee. They just don't know what's going on. How do they do it? How do they know? How do they know to start from nothing and go all exactly together? Because it's just against our understanding of how things happen.
Maybe they start rehearsing in a low frequency range.
Yeah. We can't hear it, or maybe it's super high. Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
then it's like, okay, it's 30 seconds. Bam!
Right, exactly. Yeah, it just shows a lot of stuff we just do not know. So.
Okay, so anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
for
Yeah.
this, nice lecture.
Yeah, it was good. It was fun.